In January 1841, a fur trapper in the Wind River Range wrote in his journal that he had slept well. He had been awake from roughly midnight to 2 in the morning, had heard a wolf at some distance, had decided it was not a threat, and had gone back to sleep. He recorded this the way you might record having eaten breakfast, not as an event, as a routine. If you had attempted to sleep the same way he did, in the same conditions, you would not have survived the winter. Here is what he knew that you don't. The first thing you need to understand is what cold does to a sleeping body, because this is not a story about preference or cultural difference or individual eccentricity. It is a story about physics. At 20 degrees Fahrenheit, exposed skin loses heat roughly 4 times faster than at 50. At 0, the margin between sleeping and not waking up compresses to a matter of hours, sometimes less, depending on body mass, exhaustion level, wind exposure, and the quality of whatever is between you and the ground. The ground itself is the underappreciated killer in this equation. A man lying on bare frozen earth bleeds heat downward as fast as he loses it upward into the cold air above, which means the bedroll, the buffalo robe, the pine bough mat laid carefully beneath a sleeping body. These were not comforts. They were the entire calculation between morning and not. Osborne Russell understood this. He had been in the mountains since 1834, trapping beaver across the Snake River country and the Yellowstone Basin, and he kept a journal that survived. It is one of the most precise first-hand accounts of wilderness life from the Rocky Mountain fur trade era, and it reads nothing like what you might expect. Russell wrote about sleep the way he wrote about weather, as a practical matter, something to be managed and accounted for rather than simply endured. He noted when he slept badly and why. He noted when the cold woke him. He noted what sounds the horses made and what the wind was doing. He was not complaining. He was doing what a man does when his survival depends on accurate observation of the world around him. What his journal documents, without ever naming it as such, is a sleep pattern that historians have now traced across centuries of pre-industrial human behavior. The historian Roger E. Kirch spent 16 years combing through diaries, court records, medical texts, and literary sources from medieval Europe through the early 19th century, and what he found was consistent enough to be conclusive. Before the Industrial Revolution, consolidated sleep, one unbroken block of 7 or 8 hours, was not the norm. It was barely even a concept. What people practiced across cultures and across centuries was something they called first sleep and second sleep, and the distinction was so well understood that it required no explanation in any document that mentioned it. First sleep began at dark or shortly after. It lasted roughly 4 hours. Then people woke naturally without distress and remained awake for an interval that ranged from 30 minutes to 2 hours. They used that time for prayer, for quiet conversation, for light tasks, for simply lying still in the dark thinking. Then second sleep came and lasted until dawn. Kirch found the phrase first sleep appearing so routinely in historical sources, in Chaucer, in court depositions, in physicians' manuals, that its absence would have required explanation. Its presence simply meant everyone knew what it was. The waking interval between the two sleeps was not insomnia. It had a name in some languages. It was expected. It was, for most of human history, just what nighttime looked like from the inside. The mechanism appears to be biological rather than habitual. The human body's core temperature drops in the first half of the night, bottoms out somewhere around 3 or 4 in the morning, then begins its slow climb back toward waking levels. This thermal cycle appears to create a natural shallow period partway through sleep, a seam in the architecture of the night where the body does not quite go under. Artificial light disrupts it by suppressing melatonin and pushing bedtimes later until both sleep periods collapse into one exhausted block. Remove the artificial light, as every person who has ever spent a week camping without devices has anecdotally confirmed, and the two-sleep pattern tends to reassert itself within days. The body remembers it. It never entirely forgot. Russell's men were not camping. They were wintering in mountain terrain at elevations above 6,000 feet, in temperatures that routinely dropped below zero for weeks at a stretch, and surrounded by wolves and grizzlies and the persistent low-probability risk of a raid from a band that had decided their horses were worth taking. The baseline conditions for sleep were already extreme before any of that entered the picture. The ground was frozen solid. Exposed to the open sky, a man's face and hands registered the cold within minutes of stopping. The cold was structural, not atmospheric. It came from every direction simultaneously. A fire helped, but a fire also advertised your location, required fuel you had to find and carry, and burned down to coals in roughly 3 hours, which was approximately when your core body temperature would begin its downward drift toward dangerous. And most of the men were chronically exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with one bad night. The fur trade operating season demanded physical labor from before dawn until well after dark through terrain that offered no kindness, river crossings in October, passes still holding snow in June, days of hard travel that left men covering 20 or 30 miles through country that had no interest in helping them arrive. The journals record men traveling on 4 or 5 hours of broken rest for days on end, with no recovery the season felt obliged to allow. Sleep debt accumulated the way any debt accumulates, quietly at first, then suddenly all at once. A man who had slept poorly for 3 consecutive nights in 0-degree conditions was not merely tired. He was impaired in ways he might not fully perceive. Slower to notice the ground that was too wet, slower to read the animal that was too quiet. It's slower to make the decisions that kept him alive. That was the baseline condition. Now factor in what the wilderness specifically added to that equation and why it killed the ones who learned it too late. The popular image of the mountain man's night camp runs something like this: a fire burning low, a bedroll spread on the ground, a man horizontal and unconscious from dark until dawn. That image is wrong in almost every particular that matters. The men who survived multiple seasons in the Rockies did not sleep long, did not sleep deeply, and did not sleep in the way the image suggests, because the conditions actively punished anyone who tried. The habits they developed instead looked strange to outsiders and still look strange now. They were not strange. They were the product of a remarkably efficient selection process, one in which the men who slept incorrectly were progressively and quietly removed from the record, and the ones who slept correctly were the ones still writing in their journals by spring. Start with the ground itself. Every experienced trapper understood that the frozen earth was an adversary in the thermal equation, and they treated it accordingly. Green boughs, pine, fir, cedar, were cut and laid in overlapping layers to build an insulating platform between the sleeper and the soil beneath him. The depth mattered considerably. A thin layer of boughs compressed within the first hour as body heat drove out the air pockets, and the cold wickered steadily upward through the flat needles. A proper bed required what several journals describe as a substantial thickness, enough that a man lying flat could not feel the earth through it. Buffalo robes went down first, folded double, then wrapped over the top to create a sealed envelope of still air rather than a simple blanket. The effort required to do this correctly, after a full day of hard travel in temperatures that numbed ungloved hands within minutes of stopping, was not small. Men did it anyway because the alternative was waking significantly colder than they had gone to sleep, or not waking at all. The animals contributed to this in ways that were entirely practical rather than sentimental. Dogs slept pressed against men by default. A large dog against a man's back added genuine warmth at no additional cost. And a dog that stirred in the night delivered information worth more than any other alarm system available in a mountain camp. Horses were picketed close both to prevent theft and because their behavior constituted continuous low-grade intelligence about what was happening in the surrounding dark. A horse standing quiet was one kind of information. A horse shifting weight, blowing softly, and turning its ears toward a fixed point was a different kind entirely. Men who had spent multiple seasons in the mountains learned to process those signals without fully waking, to sort sounds in their sleep the way an experienced parent sorts the sounds of a child in the night, knowing before full consciousness arrived whether something required them to move. A Jedediah Smith was described by companions as a man who seemed to need less sleep than anyone around him and who woke at sounds others never heard. What they were describing, without the vocabulary to name it, is what sleep researchers now identify as hypervigilant sleep, a state in which the brain maintains elevated sensory monitoring during stages that should, in a safe environment, be characterized by deep sensory withdrawal. In clinical contexts, hypervigilant sleep is associated with chronic threat exposure, the nervous system's learned refusal to fully stand down because experience has demonstrated that standing down has costs. Smith and the men who survived alongside him had not developed this accidentally. They had built it through seasons in which light sleeping was rewarded and deep sleeping was penalized in clear and immediate terms. The formal watch rotation acknowledged what individual biology alone could not guarantee. On the Lewis and Clark expedition, the guard schedule was recorded with the same matter-of-fact precision as miles traveled or animals killed. Men rotated through shifts short enough that no single man bore continuous responsibility through the night, and no man went entirely without sleep. It did not appear in the journals as an extraordinary measure. It appeared as a baseline operational requirement, as assumed as making fire. The man on watch was not watching only for raiders. He watched for ice sounds on rivers that might be breaking, for wind shifts that meant weather arriving faster than expected, saw for the particular quality of stillness in the horses that sometimes preceded a predator moving at the edge of the firelight. The watch failed sometimes. A man came off his shift, lay down near a fire still producing heat, and was unconscious within minutes rather than handing off. It happened even on expeditions with tight discipline. The consequences appeared in the journals without drama. A horse taken, a cache raided, occasionally a man simply absent in the morning where a man had been. What the watch system was really codifying, stated plainly, was this: sleep itself was the danger. A man in extreme cold who fell into deep, unmonitored sleep was a man whose core temperature was declining, whose shivering reflex was suppressed during certain sleep stages, and who could not monitor his own condition. The body does not reliably wake itself as hypothermia progresses. It moves in the opposite direction. As core temperature drops toward 94 or 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the sensation shifts from violent discomfort to something that resembles peace, a spreading warmth that is not warmth, a desire to rest that is not rest. Men who had witnessed hypothermia described the progression with consistent precision. The man stops complaining, stops shivering, and appears to be sleeping well. He was not sleeping well. He was dying at a pace his nervous system had been chemically persuaded to find acceptable. The men who died this way were not the careless ones who had been warned and ignored the warning. They were, more often, men who had been too tired for too many consecutive days and had fallen into the kind of sleep that the wilderness had been waiting for. The winter of 1847 produced one of the more precisely documented cases of what cold and exhaustion combined could do to a man who stopped making the right decisions about sleep. A trapper traveling alone in the Bitterroot Range made camp late, built a fire smaller than the cold required, and was found the following morning by members of his own party a quarter-mile from his intended stopping point, seated against a pine tree with his knees drawn up, dead. The fire he had built was still producing coals when they found him. He had apparently risen in the night, walked away from his camp in a direction that made no sense relative to any destination, and sat down. The men who found him reported that he looked, in the words of the account, peaceful. He had almost certainly been experiencing the hallucinatory warmth that marks the terminal phase of hypothermia. the physiological cruelty of a nervous system so cold it could no longer correctly report its own condition. He had not been careless exactly. He had been too tired to maintain the discipline that the night required. That distinction mattered to the men who wrote about him, and matters still. The ones who survived multiple winters shared characteristics that the journals document obliquely rather than directly, because the men themselves rarely framed their habits as strategies. Jedediah Smith prayed during his waking interval between sleeps. His faith was genuine, and his practice was disciplined. But the prayer also kept him awake and alert through the most physiologically dangerous window of the night. Osborne Russell used his waking hours to listen, to assess, and to make the decisions that continuous unconsciousness would have prevented. These men were not implementing a survival protocol. They were living inside a set of conditions that had quietly made certain behaviors mandatory, and they had survived long enough to internalize the lesson. The selective pressure was not subtle. The Rocky Mountain fur trade operated at its peak intensity between roughly 1820 and 1840, and the men who came to it unprepared or who failed to adapt quickly enough disappeared from the record in the first season or two. Or what remained was a population of men whose sleep habits, to any modern observer, would register as disordered, fragmented, hypervigilant, light to the point of appearing barely restorative. They were not disordered. They were calibrated. The wilderness had run an experiment on several hundred men over 2 decades, and it had returned a very clear answer about what kind of sleeping body was compatible with long-term survival in that environment. Roger E. Kirch, when he published his research on pre-industrial sleep in 2001, was writing about medieval peasants and early modern Europeans rather than Rocky Mountain trappers. But the pattern his evidence revealed, the 2-phase sleep with a natural waking interval, the absence of any cultural anxiety around that interval, the complete normality of lying awake in the middle of the night and then sleeping again, described the same underlying physiology that Russell's journal documented without ever naming it. The trappers had not invented a strange new way of sleeping. They had preserved an old one, maintained by necessity, in conditions that made the preservation non-negotiable. The artificial light hypothesis explains why most people alive today have never experienced this pattern naturally. Gaslighting arrived in cities in the early 19th century and extended the usable evening by several hours, which pushed first sleep later and later until the waking interval was crowded out entirely. Electric light completed the process by making extended wakefulness available at any hour at essentially no cost. In the 2-sleep architecture collapsed not because it was inefficient or unhealthy, but because the environmental pressure that had sustained it, real darkness, real cold, real consequence for poor decisions, was removed. What replaced it was consolidated sleep, longer, unbroken, and, E. Kirch argued, subtly less satisfying in ways that explain why a substantial fraction of the modern population reports waking in the night and lying anxious and awake for an hour before drifting off again. They are not suffering from insomnia. They are experiencing the waking interval their biology still expects, and their circumstances no longer accommodate. The cruel irony is not simply that we lost something. It is that we medicalized the loss. The symptom that pre-industrial physicians considered entirely ordinary, waking partway through the night, lying quietly, then sleeping again, became sometime in the 19th century a disorder requiring treatment. The waking interval that Russell used to listen to horses and Smith used to pray became evidence of something wrong with the person experiencing it, something to be corrected with behavioral interventions and eventually pharmaceutical ones. We did not merely abandon an ancestral sleep pattern, we diagnosed it as a pathology and spent considerable resources trying to eliminate it. Osborne Russell came down from the mountains in 1838, eventually settled in Oregon, and lived to be 66, which was not a negligible lifespan for a man who had spent years in conditions that killed younger men regularly. On he left behind a journal that remained unpublished for almost a century and is now considered one of the most reliable first-hand accounts of the fur trade era in existence. He did not comment on the strangeness of his own sleep. He had no framework that would have made it seem strange to him. He woke at 2 a.m, listened to the horses breathe, decided nothing required his attention, and went back to sleep. That was not a disorder. That was a man correctly reading the night.